Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. When I rushed into Hongman Lane in my Martin boots, the morning mist was still clinging to the leaves of the ivy. Detective Marlowe, the old policeman in navy blue uniform, straightened up under the porch, leather notebook tucked under his arm, and pronounced the word detective softly in his Alsatian accent. His temples were completely white, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were like old newspapers pressed by an iron. I later learned that Jean Poirot had been a police officer in this alley for a full 38 years. The door is not locked. The moment I opened the door, the smell of mildew and rust hit my nose. Mr. Gaston lay on his back on the faded velvet sofa, his right hand dangling on the carpet, his knuckles still stained with coffee. He was wearing a washed-out plaid shirt with all the buttons buttoned up, as if he was going to attend some important ceremony. The medical examiner said there were no external injuries. Rang's voice floated from behind. The doors and windows were all locked, and the key was in his trouser pocket. I stared at the coffee table. The yellowed drawing paper was spread out next to the cold coffee cup. The person in the painting is wearing coarse work clothes. His eyebrows and eyes are blurred as if they were soaked by rain, and only a pair of eyes remain. There is no focus in the dark brown pupils, like two balls of cotton soaked in ink. Have you ever taken photos of the scene? I took out my Polaroid camera. No. Rang's Adam's apple moved. This painting, the old man in Hongman Lane, said it was like looking at the soul of a living person. I could hear my heart beat as the photo paper clicked out. The old-fashioned clock in the corner stopped at 3:17. A half-knitted sweater was draped over the armrest of the sofa, and half of a demolition compensation agreement was stuck in the gap of the coffee table. These details turned into slides in my mind and were automatically arranged and combined. In the past 3 months, 2 elderly people have passed away in this alley. Jean flipped open his notebook. The edges of the pages curled up. One had an asthma attack, and the other fell down the stairs. But Gaston, he tapped the frame with his pencil. He was here last week to fix my pen. I squatted down. There were slight creases on the edge of the drawing paper, and there was some dust on the back, as if it had been touched repeatedly by someone. "Mrs. Madeline wants to see you." The voice came from outside the door. The old lady in a floral apron was clinging to the door frame with her knitting needles tucked behind her ears. I saw the painting 30 years ago at the entrance of a textile factory. We were standing in her tailor shop. There were 12 pots of green ivy on the windowsill, and the sunlight filtered through the gauze curtains, cutting fine lines on her face. Back then, the textile factory posted a missing person notice. She lowered her voice, knitting needles poking rapidly in the ball of yarn. The boy in the picture was an apprentice, and they said he stole the fabric. And then she suddenly stopped talking and glanced out the window. The old guys have been arguing in the bakery recently, saying, "What happened back then is about to be exposed." "What's up?" "How should I know?" She threw the ball of yarn on the table. But Gaston came to borrow a pair of scissors the day before yesterday, saying he wanted to open an old box. He had kept his box locked for 30 years, with the key hanging around his neck. On the way back, I stared at the Polaroid photos. The dust on the back of the painting is not ordinary dust. It is sawdust. Under a magnifying glass, you can see 3 pinhole-sized depressions arranged in a triangle, like some kind of mark. I stuffed the photo into the inside pocket of my windbreaker. As the police car turned the corner of the alley, I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by the second-floor window. A woman, in a beige sweater with her woolen hat pulled down low. At 10 o'clock in the evening, The fluorescent lights in the archives room buzzed. When I turned to the group photo of the Montmartre textile factory in 1983, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The third apprentice from the left in the fourth row, wearing coarse work clothes, with his eyebrows and eyes blurred as if they were deliberately erased. Exactly the same as the one in the painting at Gaston's house. The phone vibrated in my pocket. The text message was from an unfamiliar number and contained only one line of text. "Don't touch that painting." I clutched the photo. The leaves of the sycamore trees outside the window rustled, and in the distance came the roar of machinery from the demolition team. It's time to go to Lucien's thrift store tomorrow. He always says old things are more honest than people, but at this moment I stared at the apprentice's empty eyes in the photo, and suddenly remembered Mrs. Madeleine's words. The boy hanged himself in the warehouse. The blood seeped into the drawing paper, and he said it could take his life. And Gaston's old box, the key was still hanging around his neck. The wind blew up the archive pages, and the dust of 1983 fell into my eyes. By the time I stuffed the Polaroid photo into my windbreaker pocket, the police car had already stopped in front of the thrift store. "Lucien, that old fox," he stroked his chin. "I caught him selling stolen silver spoons last month, and now he's going to roll his eyes at me." The doorbell jingled. The man in the corduroy jacket was polishing a copper clock with his back to us, his grey beard on the back of his neck stained with gold powder. "Hongmen Lane is going to be demolished into a parking lot. Policeman," he said without turning around, "are you here to take care of my old bones or these old things?" "Put away the paintings," I said directly. He turned his head, with grease embedded in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. "The one at Gaston's house? This is the only portrait left of an apprentice worker my grandfather painted for a textile factory 50 years ago. 50 years ago? Jean turned to the worn notebook. "Your grandfather was a full-time painter at the Montmartre textile factory?" Lucien paused with his hand on the pendulum. "You have found out everything." He bent down and pulled out a pine box from under the counter. A musty smell emanated from it. "When the factory closed down, my grandfather stuffed all the unsold paintings in here." The paintings were spread out on the counter one after another. Faded oil paint, crooked brushstrokes. Each painting shows the same apprentice, wearing coarse cloth overalls, with his eyebrows and eyes shrouded in mist. I leaned in to look at the back, and felt sawdust on my fingertips. Triangular concave point. "It's exactly the same as the one at Gaston's house." "Are you sure that's all?" I took out my phone to take a picture. "That's all." Lucien's Adam's apple moved, and his fingers tapped unconsciously on the edge of the wooden box. "Old folks always say that there are wronged souls in the paintings. Is it a sin for me to keep them?" Jean suddenly said in an Alsatian accent. "Your grandfather's trunk. There's a new scratch in the keyhole." Lucien's face froze. I didn't ask any further questions. When we left after taking enough photos, he was squatting on the ground relocking the box, his keychain jingling on his knuckles. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Miss Margaret's apartment smelled of disinfectant. Her nephew opened the door for us with red eyes, and said that when the old lady was found last night, she was holding the painting on the bedside in her hand. "Social worker Claire just left," he sniffed. "She said she wanted to help sort out the remains." I stared at the painting on the wall. It was the same face as the one at Gaston's. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of a beige sweater hanging on the balcony. A woolen hat was draped over the back of a chair, its brim caked with pine shavings. It was the shadow at the second-floor window outside the thrift store in the morning. I rushed to the balcony. Claire had her back to me, and she was running her fingers lightly along the edge of the frame, as if she were touching something alive. Hearing the noise, she turned around suddenly. Her eyes reddened. Mrs. Margaret always said that the person in this painting can give her dreams. What dream? She lowered her head and twisted the hem of her sweater. She said that 30 years ago, someone owed a debt that shouldn't have been owed. I stared at the sawdust that hadn't been wiped clean behind her ears, and my throat tightened. At 10 o'clock that evening, I spread the photos all over the floor of my apartment. As Lucien spoke, he would tap the edge of the box 3 times with his right little finger, a detail that I captured with my photographic memory. That was his old habit when he was hiding things, and I had seen it too many times in the Major Crimes Unit. The phone vibrates. It was the message sent by Jean. The third case. Mr. Morris, 72 years old, had a painting on his bedside, and was initially ruled to have died of natural causes. I grabbed my coat and rushed downstairs. The streetlights in Hongmen Lane stretched the shadows very long, and the demolition team's excavator was parked at the entrance of the lane. Like a crouching monster, Morris's bedroom smelled of mothballs. The painting hung above the bed, and the apprentice's eyes glowed grey in the moonlight. I leaned in to look at the back, a triangular dent deeper than the first 2. Someone is counting. I took out my notebook and used the tip of my pen to crinkle the pages. Gaston, Margaret, Maurice. They are all retired workers from the textile factory. They are all stubborn tenants. Let's shine the flashlight over a nail house. The mark on the back of the painting. I flipped through the photo. The triangular concave dot is the secret number of the nail household in the demolition agreement. He gasped. So the murderer is killing people according to the demolition list. I didn't answer, staring at the words just written on the notebook. Someone is using past grievances to settle present accounts. I heard footsteps outside the window. I looked up and saw the shadow of a beige sweater flash past the window on the 2nd floor. I have to go to the thrift store again tomorrow. This time, I want to ask Lucien. When he locked the box, the extra small copper key on the keychain opened which secret compartment. When I pushed open the door to the thrift store, the doorbell rang particularly shrilly. Lucien was squatting in the corner polishing the copper candlesticks. He straightened up when he heard the noise, and the pine shavings on his beard gleamed in the morning light. Detective Marlowe, he rubbed his hands together. Want to look at some old pocket watches today? Your grandfather painted the work signs for the Montmorency textile factory. Right. I took a Polaroid photo on the counter, a partial portrait of the Gaston family. Is this person in the painting an old acquaintance of your grandfather? His fingers slipped across the candlestick, and the copperware clanged against the wooden cabinet. I also heard. I stared at the extra brass key on his keychain. That your grandfather once hid a blood painting. Lucien's face instantly turned as pale as faded wall paint. He glanced at the shop door, walked quickly around the counter, and lifted a piece of blue cloth to reveal a carved wooden box. The inside of the lid is engraved with Degas 1892, which matches the date on his grandfather's work badge. It happened 30 years ago. He lowered his voice and tapped his knuckles on the box board. Apprentice Antoine discovered that the factory used inferior cotton thread and secretly wrote a letter of complaint. The factory manager said that the fabric was lost in the warehouse and insisted that he stole it. I took out a pen and wrote on the notebook. Then he hanged himself in his dormitory. Lucien's Adam's apple moved. Before he died, he used his fingernails to dip into blood and drew a self-portrait on the wall. His eyes were as big as bells. It was carved in the same mold as these paintings now. Where's the blood painting? The factory director and his men tore it up. He opened the wooden box and took out a yellowed paper. My grandfather secretly collected the fragments and repainted it according to the original. This is the police report from that year. Antoine's autopsy report said mechanical asphyxiation, but the case was closed like that. I took a picture of the date on the report. The date the textile mill closed was exactly the same as the date on Mrs. Margaret's retirement certificate. The phone was vibrating and getting hot in my pocket. It was the photos that were sent by me, 3 bank statements. The transfer time was all this month, and the recipient's account name was painted in black. I just checked the accounts of the 3 deceased people. His voice squeezed out of the phone. Each person transferred 150,000 euros, and the note was compensation. Who is the recipient? I can't find it. He paused. and there was a door slamming in the background. I went to ask Gaston, the landlord who always clamored to demolish Redgate Lane. He said, "The old man's money can be transferred as he pleases." The door almost hit me on the nose. I held the phone tightly. What did Gaston do in the textile factory? Warehouse manager. Jean's voice sank. It can be connected to Antoine's case. After hanging up the phone, I rushed into the police station's archives room. I found the 1993 issue of the Montmartre Times in a pile of old newspapers. The headline on the front page was eye-catching. A sudden fire broke out in a textile factory, and important account books were burned. In the photo, Gaston is wearing work clothes and standing in front of a smoking warehouse, his expression mostly obscured by the black smoke. My hands were shaking when I compared the photo with my work ID. The apprentice in the painting and Antoine's ID photo, thick eyebrows, a mole at the left corner of the eye, and even the curve of the corners of the mouth are exactly the same. The painting spirit is asking for my life, I muttered to the computer screen. Someone is borrowing the ghost's shell to collect a debt that has been owed for 30 years. At midnight I squatted in the alley across from the thrift store. The shadow of a beige sweater flashed past the second-floor window, followed by the sound of metal scraping against a lock cylinder. Claire crouched into the shop and headed straight for the carved wooden box. Moonlight filtered through the skylight, illuminating a painting she was holding out. She ran her fingers over the canvas, tears falling on the paint. "Dad, they're finally going to pay it back." I leaned closer to the glass and read the words on the back of the painting. Father, Antoine O'Hara. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone in the bureau started ringing. No, 14 Hongmen Lane. The elderly man, Francois, who lived alone, is missing. The colleague's voice was trembling. The passbook is gone. The door is open. There is a note on the table, and an unfinished portrait. As I rushed downstairs, the heels of my Martin boots made a thudding sound on the stairs. Francois's bedroom smelled of cold coffee, and a crumpled note lay on the table with a string of numbers written crookedly on it.
I pulled out a copy of the 1993 compensation agreement from the archives, the total amount of money the government allocated to workers to resettle when the textile factory closed down.
The portrait only showed half of the face, with the area where the eyes should be was left empty, like a black hole. I stared at the number on the note and my throat tightened. The fire 30 years ago burned the account books. The paintings 30 years later need to be paid for. This isn't a ghost asking for revenge. I took out my phone to call Jean, my fingertips lingering on the dial key. This is a person asking for a debt. The roar of excavators came from outside the window, and the demolition team's flags fluttered in the wind. I stared at the unfinished eyes in the painting, and suddenly remembered what Mrs. Madeleine had said. There must be 7 people in the painting before they can be revealed on the night of the demolition. Now there are 4. I stared at the number on the note. 4. Francois's coffee cup was still steaming, and half of the face in the portrait was turning green in the morning light. Mrs. Madeleine said that there was a nail house mark, the size of a fingernail on the back of each painting, like the number in the demolition agreement in an old newspaper. In the old factory photos, Antoine's ID number, for 500,000, maybe a number. I clutched the note and rushed into the archives. The old file bag was covered in dust on the iron rack, and the 1993 compensation agreement was curled up at the edges. The old administrator adjusted his glasses and said, "The account of the textile factory has been burned long ago. What are you looking for?" Subsidiary ledger. I thought of the photo of Gaston standing at the fire scene. The fire didn't burn everything. The old man snorted and dragged out a metal box from the bottom floor. The musty smell makes people cough. I turned the pages one by one, and suddenly stopped. The yellowed pages had burn marks on the edges, but they clearly read, "Antoine O'Hara is disqualified from compensation due to suspected theft." The pen words have watermarks on them, as if someone had cried. The phone vibrates. Jean's voice floated over from Redgate Lane. Isabel confessed. The compensation list was drawn up by lawyer Andre. Andre? I clutched the paper. Gaston's father. Jean's notebook rustled. The current landlord of Redgate Lane. His son still lives in the ancestral house. The heels of my Doc Martens boots clattered against the tiled floor as I rushed back to the station. The doorbell of Lucine's thrift store dinged. He was wiping the copper candlestick with a soft cloth. When he looked up, his beard trembled. Detective, are you here to check the old paintings again? I unfolded the note. This string of numbers is a new code discovered by the police. Lucine's hand paused on the candlestick. He bent down and pulled out an iron box from under the counter. The lock was rusted. My grandfather gave it to me before he died. He said, if anyone comes to ask for the number, give it to her. There was a note in the tin box, and the number was exactly the same as the one on the note. There is also a torn account book with burnt edges of the pages, but neat handwriting. On May 17, 1993, batches of cotton thread were replaced, and warehouse manager Gaston signed for it. False reporting of fire casualties. Lawyer Andre drafted a false confession. Antoine O'Hara discovered problems with the raw materials, framed him for theft, and destroyed evidence. I turned to the last page and saw the ink smudged. Compensation for 500,000 francs, minus the loss of theft. The remainder to be divided equally. The excavator outside the window made a shrill sound. I stared at the word equally divided on the account book, and suddenly remembered Claire's tears when she was squatting in the thrift store. On the back of the painting she was holding, it was written, Father, Antoine O'Hara. It was 10 o'clock at night, and I was curled up on the sofa in my apartment. The lamp shone on the spread out evidence, portraits, account books, notes. Claire's face flickered in her memory, her smile when she brought hot soup to the elderly man living alone, the trembling of her fingertips when she touched the picture frame, and the painting she happened to find in the thrift store before Francois disappeared. She's not trying to kill anyone, I said to the air. She's trying to get them to pay back the money. They used the legend of painting spirits seeking revenge to scare the elderly and force them to hand over the compensation they had embezzled. Every death and every lost passbook is a wake-up call. Either pay back the money or become the next target of the ghost. The phone vibrated on the coffee table. Jean's number popped up, and I pressed the answer button. Jean, we have to find Claire immediately. She's not killing people. She's liquidating. There was a sudden silence on the other end of the phone. I heard the sound of sirens approaching, and the rapid breathing. Alice, where are you now? My house. What's wrong? 17 Redgate Lane. Claire's apartment. Jean's voice was tense. The patrol just passed by. The door is open. I grabbed my coat and rushed downstairs. The night wind blew into my windbreaker, and the streetlights in Hongman Lane flickered. Claire's window was dark. A ray of moonlight leaked through the crack in the door. It was empty inside. My heels scraped across the threshold as I rushed into Claire's apartment. She raised the flashlight and let the beam sweep across the empty living room. An A4 paper was spread out on the coffee table, with half a muffin pressed on the corner. It was the honey oatmeal muffin that she often brought to the elderly living alone. Ledger, Jean whispered. I leaned over and saw that the handwriting on the photocopy was exactly the same as the burnt account book in the thrift store. Even the ink smudges on the word equally divided were exactly the same. There were 3 letters stacked next to it, with the envelopes labeled to Francois's daughter, to Isabelle's granddaughter, and to Germaine's adopted son, respectively. I pulled out the top one. The letter paper was the off-white note that Claire often used. The handwriting was so neat that it looked like it was engraved. Your grandfather, grandmother, exchanged my father's life for 400,000 francs. When he was hanged in the attic of the textile factory, he still had the test sheet in his pocket that exposed the problem of raw materials. Let the flashlight swing to the wall. There was a cardboard box leaning against it. with half of the picture frame exposed. It was an old portrait I had seen at the scene of Francois's crime. The red paint on the back that marked Nail House had not yet dried. "She has been to Gaston's house 3 times, I said suddenly. 3 days ago, when I was on patrol, I saw Claire at the second floor window. She was holding a thermos bucket and said she was delivering ginger tea to her old landlord. Gaston was the person in charge of the demolition compensation, and was also the name in the account book as Gaston the warehouse manager signed for. Rang took out the intercom and said, 'Dispatch center. Locate the old house at the end of Hongman Lane.' He turned to look at me, his Adam's apple moving. That is the ancestral home of the Fernand family, where the textile factory board of directors held a meeting in. We were running past a red brick wall, covered in vines, when sirens blasted at the entrance of the alley. The iron door of the old house was ajar, and a cold white light leaked through the gap. I heard Claire's voice, 2 notes lower than usual. 'You took everything from him, now it's my turn to take it back.' The moment I pushed open the door, I saw Gaston huddled in a wicker chair, and his daughter Margaret was clutching her cell phone with her knuckles turning white. Claire stood opposite the two of them, holding a new painting in her arms. The person in the painting was a young man in coarse work clothes, and the background was a factory with broken walls and tiles, which was exactly the same as the plan map on the demolition notice of Hongman Lane. "Madman," Gaston shouted. "Isn't it enough that you killed old Francois? Let's take a half step forward. Claire, let's go back to the bureau and talk. He is the thief." I interrupted him and slapped the copy of the account book on the mahogany table. On May 17, 1993, Gaston Fernand signed for the stolen batch of cotton thread. You and your lawyers forged fire casualties and burned Antoine O'Hara's letter of accusation as evidence of theft. The $4 million in compensation was deducted from the loss, and the remaining money was divided between you. Margaret's cell phone fell to the ground with a bang. She stared at her father's signature on the copy, her lips trembling. "Dad, this isn't true?" Claire smiled, stroking the frame with her fingertips. "I didn't kill anyone." Francois fell down the stairs while trying to find his passbook in the dark of night. Isabelle had a heart disease and saw the man in the painting standing at the head of her bed, but couldn't reach her heart pills. Germain was even more ridiculous. He hid his passbook in the attic, and it was gnawed by rats, causing him to suffer a cerebral hemorrhage. She turned to look at me. I just made what they did back then come alive in the painting. Suddenly the intercom rang. "Support will arrive in 5 minutes." Gaston stood up suddenly and threw his skinny hands over the account book on the table. I subconsciously touched the Polaroid camera, and the flash went off. He covered his eyes and knocked over the rattan chair. I took the opportunity to grab the copy and stuffed it into my arms. "Does your father know you're doing this?" I asked, panting. Claire's fingers rested on the eyebrows of the person in the painting. The moonlight filtered in through the broken window, illuminating a lock of red hair sticking up from beneath her woolen hat, exactly like the birthmark behind Antoine's ear in the painting. "He knows I will seek justice for him," she said softly. The supporting police lights dyed the window frames red. When 2 police officers handcuffed Claire, she suddenly turned around and said, "I hid those passbooks in the old well of the textile factory. The password is mine." I stood at the door of the old house and watched them escort the people away. The wind blew up the copy of the account book, and on one of the pages, the words falsely reporting fire casualties were rustling. The stairs that Francois fell down, the heart pills that Isabelle couldn't reach, Germain's passbook that was gnawed by rats. Are these accidents really just terrifying coincidences? The corridors of the police station were empty late at night. I leaned against the glass of the interrogation room and watched Claire with her head hung and her woolen hat slipped to the back of her neck. Her shadow was stretched long by the light, like a wet portrait. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from the evidence department. Traces of turpentine were detected on Francois's stair railing. I stared at the screen and suddenly remembered that 3 days ago in the thrift store, Claire was squatting in front of the painting box wiping her tears. The label on the can of turpentine next to her had been rubbed off by half. The incandescent light in the interrogation room made my eyes hurt. I stared at Claire on the other side of the glass. Her woolen hat had slipped down to the back of her neck, revealing a pale nape, the same curve as Antoine's drooping neck in the painting. My phone vibrated in my palm, and a message from the evidence department popped up. The turpentine on Francois's stair railing matches the composition of the can at the thrift store. The scene from 3 days ago suddenly popped into my mind. Claire squatted in front of Lucien's painting box, wiping her tears. Next to her was a can of turpentine with half of the label rubbed off, revealing the faded 90. At the time, I thought she was just touched by the old paintings, but now I understand. She was waxing the handrails. Turpentine can soften wood fibers and make the aging handrails more fragile. The ledger is just the beginning. The words she said before she was arrested suddenly rang in her ears. I rushed into the elevator, holding my phone tightly. When I went downstairs, I bumped into an intern who was delivering coffee. The hot drink spilled on my police uniform and I didn't even bother to wipe it off. Lucien's thrift store had its shutters drawn. I knocked 10 times before I heard the sound of dragging footsteps. "Miss Alice?" He rubbed his eyes and opened the door, his grey beard stained with cotton wool. "In the middle of the night. Are there any unopened wooden boxes of your grandfather's painting boxes?" I interrupted him. He was stunned for a moment, then turned around and pulled out a rusty copper key. "The camphor wood box at the bottom," my grandfather said. "Don't touch it until it's demolished." When the wooden box was opened, a pungent smell of camphor rose up. At the bottom of the box lay an unfinished oil painting of Antoine, with the tip of the brush resting on his clenched right fist, where the letter of denunciation should have been held. The back of the painting is densely written with names: Gaston, Francois, Isabelle. There is an amount next to each name, and the ink is from the same pen as the signature on the account book. "This is," Lucien looked closer, "my grandfather's annotation. He said they burned the letters, but they couldn't burn the numbers." At this moment, the cell phone rang. It was Jean Poirot. His Alsatian accent was thicker than usual. "Alice, there's something wrong with the autopsy report." There was digitalis residue in Francois' stomach. Isabelle's first aid bottle, Margaret's place. I blurted out. 3 days ago at Gaston's house, Margaret helped her old father take medicine, and her fingertips stayed on the medicine bottle for 3 seconds. That was the action of hiding something. The 3 a.m. search warrant went more smoothly than expected. In the drawer of Margaret's dressing table, there was half a bag of digitalis powder. She knelt on the carpet and cried, saying that her father always said that the money back then was dirty, that the old people started to suffer from insomnia after Claire moved in, and that she just wanted to let them go in peace. "I didn't mean to kill anyone." She grabbed my trouser leg. "They already have heart disease." I pulled my leg back. The powder in the evidence bag glowed coldly under the light. Compared to the coincidence that Claire used, this was a real murder. 7 days after Claire's application for commutation of sentence was submitted, I went to the prison with a copy of the sorted account books. She was sitting in the visiting room, wearing a woolen hat neatly on her head. When she saw me come in, she suddenly smiled and said, "Did you find out? Margaret poisoned you, and you only did something accidental." I pushed the copy over. "But the law will not forgive you just because you only did something." She lowered her head and turned the page, her fingertips pausing on the words Antoine O'Hara. My mother said that the last self-portrait he drew had red eyes. Her voice was as light as a sigh, but all I found were the burned letters and the accounts of the spoils. "Maybe what your father wants is not revenge." I thought of the unfinished painting in the painting box. Antoine's right fist clenched. "It's that someone remembers what he didn't finish saying." She looked up at me and her eyes gradually turned red. This was the first time I saw softness in her eyes. like a piece of mist that could not be melted. It was drizzling on the day when Hongman Lane was demolished. I walked across the blue stone slabs in my Martin boots. Most of the vines had been pulled down by a bulldozer, revealing a mottled red brick wall. The cast iron street lamps were still on, with fine raindrops floating in the light. On the cover of the notebook was a photo taken on the first day of her arrival, at the entrance of an alley, covered with vines. Claire, wearing a woolen hat, was supporting old lady Isabel. I wrote on the back of the photo, "Some memories should never be torn down." The wind suddenly grew stronger, blowing up a piece of yellowed paper in the corner. I bent down to pick it up, but when I saw the face and eyebrows of the person in the painting clearly, my hand stopped in midair. It was a portrait of Antoine. Unlike the paintings at the crime scene, the corners of his mouth were slightly raised, as if he was saying something that was finally heard. Raindrops fell into the cracks of the picture frame, and I heard the roar of a forklift in the distance. When the wind picked up again, the painting page trembled slightly, as if it was about to fly through fingers. The blue stone slabs of Hongman Lane were soaked and shiny by the rain. I squatted down, and just as my fingertips touched the drawing paper that was floating towards me, the wind blew raindrops towards me again, and the corner of the drawing rubbed against my palm like a frightened butterfly. Melo Jean Poirot's umbrella came over me, and the rain fell on the ribs and hit the back of my neck. "We should go back to the police station in this weather." I didn't move. Antoine in the painting has a smile on his face, completely different from the gloomy portraits in the case files. The Polaroid camera made a click sound, and as the photographic paper developed in my palm, I caught a glimpse of a thin black edge on the edge of the paper. It was not natural damage, but was caused by fire. "There's no trace of this in Claire's painting box." I held the painting up to him. "She wants revenge, so she won't leave this kind of flaw." Jean Poirot flipped through his old notebooks. "Last week, when we were demolishing yard number 23, some workers said they saw smoke coming out of the ruins." He poked the note in the notebook with the tip of a pencil. "They said some paper was burning, but I couldn't see it clearly from a distance." The rain suddenly got heavier. I stuffed the painting into the inner pocket of my windbreaker and hung the Polaroid camera on my wrist. We walked along the base of the wall into the depths of the ruins. Dismantled window frames were piled under the broken wall, and ivy vines were entangled on rusty iron wires like a tangled mess. "Wait." Jean Poirot suddenly stopped. The tip of his leather shoe was touching a half-broken door panel. A notice saying, "To be demolished soon," was posted on the faded red paint. "This house should have been cleared out 3 days ago. The door is not locked." The moment I opened the door, the musty smell wrapped in moisture pressed over me. There was a wooden table against the wall, on which stood a chipped mug with brown coffee stains on the bottom. It was obvious that someone had just used it. "Isabelle Renault." A hoarse voice suddenly sounded behind him. Lucien's second-hand tricycle was parked outside the yard, with raindrops on his beard. "This is the old lady's house. Last week I came to collect old furniture, and she said she wanted to keep the dresser for her grandson to marry off." I took out my phone to check the system. Isabel's relocation registration column was empty, and her bank statement stopped 3 months ago. She never withdrew any money after the demolition compensation was received. Where did she move to? I turned to Lucien and asked. He scratched his chin and said, he said he was going to Lyon to join his niece. But I ran into her niece at the market the day before yesterday, and she said she didn't pick up the old man at all. The roar of a bulldozer could be heard in the rain. Pierre Rossi came over from the other side of the ruins, his overalls stained with cement at the knees, holding a yellowed piece of letter in his hand. I found it when I was clearing the rubble just now. His voice was as low as a whisper. I was working overtime last night and heard voices in this room. It sounded like someone was reading something. The corners of the letter were wrinkled by water, but the handwriting was clear. The real painting spirit has not yet appeared. They burned my paintings but could not burn my eyes. My hand holding the paper tightened. This was not Claire's handwriting, nor was it Antoine's. Jean Poirot took out his reading glasses and said, "This paper is the special letterhead of the Montmartre textile factory. It's from 30 years ago. We returned at dusk. I was carrying a high-powered flashlight, and Jean Poirot was carrying a baton. The streetlights in the ruins had long been removed, and the cold light from the mobile phone screen cast two swaying shadows on the wall. The wooden ladder to the attic creaked. Jean Poirot's flashlight swept across the corner of the wall, and a corner of the iron box appeared from the dust. The dark red paint was peeling, and the lock was covered with green rust, but there was no sign of having been pried open. There should be a key. I squatted down, and just as my fingertips touched the lid of the box, Jean Poiret suddenly grabbed my arm. "Wait." He used his baton to pick open the cobwebs on the edge of the box. "The dust is fresh. Someone has moved it recently." The contents of the box took my breath away. On the top is a hardcover diary with Montmartre Textile Factory 1968 printed on the cover. Underneath are 5 portraits. The eyebrows and eyes of the first one are almost the same as the one at the crime scene, but the signature is not the name of Degas' grandfather. It is Louis Durand. Jean Poirot's hands were shaking as he flipped through his diary. On July 15th, 1968, the factory director said, "My design was too dark, but I was drawing fabric that had been soaked in a dye vat." He read aloud. "On July 22, Antoine saw me hiding the blueprint, and he said he wanted to go to the Union with me." I turned to the last page. The ink smudged like tears. They burned my albums and Antoine's self-portraits, but I put the truth into every portrait, and if the truth can't speak, let the painting speak. The attic window frame suddenly creaked. The draft blew dust in, causing the pages of the diary to rustle. I raised my head, and the circle of light of the strong flashlight swept across the corner of the wall. There was a dark figure standing there, with 2 eyes glowing faintly in the shadow. "Ooh," I blurted out, but the flashlight only illuminated a cracked mirror. Jean Poirot put his hand on my shoulder. "Marlowe." I didn't say anything. Behind me in the mirror there was clearly a shadow that flickered. When the wind started to blow again, the portrait in the iron box trembled slightly, and the eyes of the person in the painting seemed to follow my movements. The rain is still falling. In the distance, the whistle of a bulldozer finishing work was heard, but the temperature in the attic suddenly dropped. I took out my Polaroid camera and pressed the shutter button in front of the mirror. The photographic paper slowly developed in the darkness, and the photo only showed my shadow, Jean Poirot's, and a thin crack on the mirror. But those eyes just now were clearly right behind the crack. I stared at the Polaroid film all night. The after-image of the eyes in the crack of the mirror burned a hole in the retina. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I took out the iron box diary from the evidence bag. On the 7th page was a yellowed photo. At the entrance of the Montmartre textile factory, a young man in blue work clothes was holding painting supplies, with a teardrop mole at the right corner of his eye. The eyes are exactly the same as the ones in the portrait at the crime scene. "Marlowe," Jean Poirot called at 6:07. "The last house on Redgate Lane that has not been demolished. The owner is Audrey Doran." His voice was as hoarse as sandpaper. "The neighbor said that she has an unfinished portrait on her windowsill. It looks like it was carved from the same mold as the one in the iron box you showed me." The rain had not stopped when I put on my Martin boots and rushed downstairs. There are only 3 houses left standing in Redgate Lane. Audrey's house is at the very end, with the wall peeling like a gnawed bread. A piece of grey cloth is hung on the 2nd floor window, revealing half a painting, with a high-nose bridge and slightly raised eyes, and the same breathing rhythm as the signed portrait of Louis Durand in the iron box. "She won't open the door." Jean Poirot held up his community work certificate and knocked on the door frame with his knuckles. There was no sound from inside the door, only the smell of oil paint mixed with turpentine seeping out from the crack in the door. I stood on tiptoe to look at the windowsill. There was half a mud print on the edge of the picture frame, and the pattern was exactly the same as the sole of the rubber boots used on the construction site.
Pierre, the builder, brought it this morning. Jean-Paul suddenly pulled out a paper package wrapped in plastic.
When I unfolded it, the musty smell made me take a step back. 12 portraits, with curled edges and peeling paint, and the eyes in each one looked alive. Pierre found it while digging the foundation at the construction site. It was buried under the concrete. It looked like it crawled out from the ground. His Adam's apple rolled as he said this. It looks exactly like the painting at the murder scene a while ago. I spread out all the drawings in the police evidence room. Jean Poirot held up a magnifying glass. The painter who disappeared from the Montmartre textile factory in 1968 was named Henri Leclerc. He flipped through the old files and saw a teardrop mole on the right corner of the man's eye in the photo. Lucien's grandfather mentioned that he later went crazy and kept saying there is blood in the painting. I stared at the eyes in the portrait. Henri Leclerc, Louis Duron, the unfinished work on Audrey's windowsill, and the one at the crime scene. The curvature of all the pupils, the direction of the eyelashes, all fit into the same mold. Audrey's household registration information. Jean Poirot pushed a piece of paper over. Born in 1955, her father's column says, unknown, and her mother is a cleaner at the Montmartre textile factory. He tapped the file page for Henri Leclerc. In 1967, Henri had a brief affair with a cleaner at the factory. The rain stopped late at night. I squatted on the old locust tree in Audrey's backyard, pointing the Polaroid camera at the window on the second floor that had no curtains drawn. The room was filled with easels, and the portraits on the walls were a mess. There was an old worker smoking a pipe, a little girl in a floral dress, and the one in the middle was my profile. The photo paper felt hot in my palm. I remember it very clearly. When I first came to Hongmen Lane 3 days ago, I was wearing a black windbreaker and standing by the ruins. The moment the wind lifted my bangs, someone took the shutter, but the me in the painting, with raindrops on my eyelashes, looked exactly like I did last night in the attic. Click. I pressed another one. This time, the picture was taken of the drawing table in the corner. The canvas was covered with white cloth, revealing half of the wrist. The skin was loose, and the blood vessels were bulging. It was an old man's hand. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Jean Poirot sent a message. I found out Audrey goes to the Sacre-Cœur every Wednesday tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I stared at myself in the photo. The person in the painting narrowed his eyes slightly, as if looking at something behind me. The wind suddenly got stronger. The leaves of the locust trees rustled, and the window on the second floor was pushed open with a creak. I held my breath and saw the white-haired old man sticking his head out, holding a palette knife in his hand, and a corner of the white cloth on the canvas was lifted by the wind. It's a self-portrait. I squeezed the Polaroid camera.
There was still tree sap on the edge of the photographic paper, but both I in the painting and the self-portrait drawn by the old man in the window had a teardrop mole in the right corner of my eye. At 1:17 a.m., I sent a message to the police department's physical evidence department, requesting a search warrant. 37 Redgate Lane, Audrey Duran's residence. Outside the window, the moon was half covered by clouds. I took out the diary from the iron box. The ink on the last page was dark brown in the moonlight, like blood. The light in Audrey's window suddenly went out. In the darkness I seemed to see those eyes again, behind the cracks in the mirror, in the pupils of the portrait, at the deepest part of all buried truths, watching quietly. And tomorrow, I will lift up the white cloth. Hongmen Alley, at 3 o'clock in the morning, is like an old clock. I stood in front of number 37 holding the search warrant. The metal door knocker was still wet with last night's rain. The door was unlocked. When I pushed it, the hinges made a crackling sound, like someone coughing in their throat.
Audrey is in the studio on the second floor. She had her back to the door. Her white hair glowed silver under the floor lamp. Her palette was on her knees, and the woman on the canvas was turning her face away. It was a face I had never seen before, with a teardrop mole at the corner of her eye, exactly in the same position as the corner of my right eye. The background was not the old worker she usually drew, but a blueprint with the 3 words Hongmen Lane circled in red pen and demolition area marked next to it. Detective. She didn't turn around. The coffee is cold in the kitchen on the first floor. I touched the pistol on my lower back. The holster was empty. There was no need to bring live ammunition for a community search, but my hand pressed it against it out of habit. Who is the person in the painting? My brother. She dipped the paint in cobalt blue. No, it's how he imagines himself. The paintbrush dotted the blueprint. He always said that these papers could take up the entire alley. I pulled out the photo. The scene of Henri Leclerc's death. The portrait of an old man smoking a pipe at the bedside. The little girl in a floral dress at Louis Durand's house. And the unfinished profile in the window that I took last night on the locust tree. The eyes of all the portraits are now staring at me in Audrey's palette. Your brother was an apprentice in the Montmartre textile factory. Antoine O'Hara's assistant. She turned finally. The old man's eyes were grey-blue, like a piece of glass soaked in water. In 1968, my brother discovered that the factory used inferior cotton thread to pass off as Egyptian long staple cotton, and sold all the shoddy fabrics to the army. He took the account book to the police, and was blocked at the alley when he came back. She raised her palette knife, and the blade reflected my clenched jaw. They said he stole silver from the warehouse, and he was crazy. There were footsteps downstairs. Jean Perez's Alsatian accent came up first. Alice, the file has been retrieved. He held up the yellowed paper page. In August 1968, Jean-Marie Durand, a textile factory employee, was forcibly sent to the hospital for mental disorder and died in Saint-Anne Hospital 3 months later. The death certificate said pneumonia, but there was a painting in the medical record. He pulled out a copy, and it was exactly the same as the old worker smoking a pipe on the wall of Audrey's studio. Audrey smiled. Her smile was like an old wooden door cracking open, letting in some aged sunlight. He painted more than 300 paintings in the hospital. The nurse said he always said, "Let these faces speak for me." But when I arrived, there was only half a box of paint left in the ward. She pointed to the old wooden box in the corner. Later I found them in Lucien's grandfather's warehouse. A bell suddenly rang in the corridor. Lucien came in first, in his floral apron, his grey beard stained with sawdust. "Let me show you something." He spread out a piece of brittle letter paper, the ink already smudged. "My grandfather wrote this in Mr. Durand's paintings are too hot to be left in the light. I hid them in the attic, under the 3rd pine board, until someone remembered to take them out." I took out my phone and looked through the photos. There was indeed a scratch on the back of the painting in Henry's house, as thin as a mosquito's foot. It was the grain of the pine board. So those paintings that appeared at the murder scene were taken from Lucien's grandfather's attic? I asked Audrey. "I just put them back where they belong." She put down her paintbrush. "Henry Louis and Madame Madeleine all signed the testimony that proved my brother stole the silver." She tapped the plan with her knuckles. "Now that the demolition money has come in, they want to bury the account books and fabric samples in the foundation." I remembered what Mrs. Madeleine had said. What happened back then will be exposed.
I remembered the calming tea that Claire always added to the old people's teacups. The autopsy report showed that the tea was mixed with trace amounts of digoxin, which could cause cardiac arrest if taken for a long time.
But what really gave me a chill was what I found yesterday at Claire's social worker's office. A yellowed birth certificate locked in her drawer, with Antoine O'Hara written in the father's column. "Claire doesn't know where these paintings came from," Audrey said. "She only knows that the old people swallowed the compensation that should have belonged to her." While she was spiking the tea, I placed the painting by their bedside. We both thought we were avenging Antoine. Jean Poirot's notebook rustled. He wrote, Margaret Dupont, 84 years old, lives alone, and was a warehouse manager at a textile factory. Her insulin pen had been replaced with a digoxin solution. He looked up. Claire went to check her blood sugar every Wednesday. I took out the USB drive from my pocket. Inside was the toxicology report from the physical evidence department, as well as the chat records on Claire's computer. She and Margaret's granddaughter were discussing how to make Grandma pass away in a dignified manner. I'm going to file a full report, I told Audrey. Claire's motive was revenge, but Margaret was the one who actually did the poisoning. Your paintings don't kill people, they just mirror, she finished for me, reflects those who are afraid to look at themselves. The sound of the demolition team's bulldozers was heard a week later. I stood in front of the ruins. The wind blew the broken bricks into my collar. I held the painting that Audrey gave me in my arms. The woman in the painting stood at the intersection of light and shadow, with a tilted red brick wall behind her, as if it was about to fall into the light. Some memory should not be torn down, I said to the wind. A corner of the drawing paper was suddenly lifted up. I hurriedly pressed it, but when I saw the woman's eyes clearly, my fingers suddenly stopped. She was clearly looking at the old locust tree on the left just now, but now the roar of the bulldozers drowned out the sound of my heartbeat. I clamped the painting back in place, and as I turned around I ran into Jean Poirot's arms. He was holding an iron box in his hand, and the bottom of the box was stained with dark brown stuff that looked like blood. Found it in Audrey's attic, he said. Guess what's in it? I didn't guess. I stared at the scratches on the edge of the iron box. The lines were exactly the same as the nail house marks on the back of the paintings at the crime scene. The wind is getting strong again. The drawing paper rustled in my arms, as if someone was whispering in my ear. I looked down at the painting and saw that the woman's eyes had turned straight ahead, facing the pile of bricks in the ruins that had not yet been flattened. There, half of a rotten wooden board was exposed. I stared at the self-portrait on the wall of Audrey's living room, and my back teeth ached. The woman in the painting is wearing my black windbreaker, and her Martin boots are stained with the brick dust of Hongman Lane. Even the small light brown mole at the end of my left eyebrow is exactly the same. But I swear, this is the first time I've ever stepped into this old house covered in ivy. Your brother? I heard my voice tighten. Audrey was watering the green ivy on the windowsill with water dripping down the tips of the leaves. He left 10 years ago. When she turned around, her woolen hat slipped down a little, revealing an old scar behind her ear. Before he left, he said that some futures are destined to be drawn. The Polaroid camera clicked. The photo paper felt hot in my palm. I stared at myself in the photo. The corners of the eyes of the person in the painting were slightly upturned, similar to me in the mirror, but also different. It's time to go. I stuffed the photo paper into the inner pocket of my windbreaker. Audrey didn't keep me. She just stood at the door and said, "Those paintings are not curses." The wind lifted the brim of her hat. "They are mirrors. Let your phone vibrate in your pocket." His Alsatian accent was thicker than usual. Isabelle Renew shows up. The wind in the ruins was wrapped in cement dust. I followed him into a half-collapsed warehouse, and the musty smell made me cough. There was a pile of torn cotton wool and empty cans in the corner. Isabelle huddled in the innermost part, her white hair covered with cobwebs. She saw me and suddenly rushed over, digging her nails into my wrist. "They're back. The people in the painting." "Who?" Jean held her shaking shoulders. The old woman's pupils contracted violently. Antoine's eyes. "Yesterday at midnight. The painting on my windowsill." She suddenly fell silent, as if someone had grabbed her throat. "What painting?" I asked. Isabelle shook her head, her nails digging deep into her palms. "I didn't burn it clean. They said they would give me compensation if I didn't tell anyone." Jean's intercom rang. It was Pierre Rossi's loud voice. "Detective Marlowe, come to the construction site." The excavator's steel claw rested over the pit. Pierre squatted at the edge of the pit, holding a rotten easel in his gloved hands. There were 3 or 4 canvases scattered next to the easel, with curled edges and paint peeling like an old man's skin. Just found it. He handed me one of them. In the faded oil paint, the outline of a young woman gradually became clear. High nose bridge, thin lips, and 70% like Claire. The signature was illegible, but the letters Antoine O'Hara were still recognizable. These paintings. Pierre's Adam's apple moved. They looked like they crawled out from the ground looking for someone. It was already dark when I returned to the apartment with the painting. All the photos covered the dining table, portraits of the murder scene, Audrey's self-portraits, and old works that Pierre had dug up. I bit off the cap of a red pen and marked serial numbers in the corners of each photo. Painting number 1. The bedside of the victim, Gaston. The person in the painting is wearing coarse work clothes and has resentful eyes. Before his death, Gaston always said, "I saw the apprentice who was driven away by me that year." Painting number 2. Margaret's bedroom. The person in the painting is holding an account book in her hand. The old account books in the safe disappeared on the night her insulin pen was swapped. Painting number 3. Audrey's self-portrait, with a Polaroid bulging out of my trench coat pocket. I just wore this coat today. I suddenly stopped. I used to think that these paintings were similar in style, but now I realize that the brushstrokes, light and shadow in each painting imitate the memories of different victims. The direction of the shadow in Gaston's painting completely matches the angle of the window of his factory warehouse 30 years ago. The warm yellow halo in Margaret's painting looks very much like the desk lamp in the finance office that she always said was the warmest. "They are responding," I said to the air. The clock on the wall struck 11. Audrey's diary was open under the lamp. I turned to the page where she wrote, "Painting is not a curse. It is a testimony," and the ink suddenly hurt my eyes. There was an extra line of words on the originally blank page, and the pen handwriting was completely different from Audrey's. "You can't escape either." A shadow flashed outside the window. I rushed over and drew aside the curtains, only to see the moonlight reflected through the glass of the building opposite. The wind blew up the diary, and the pages rustled to the last page. There was an old photo there, a young man in work clothes, standing at the door of a textile factory with a work badge on his chest. Antoine O'Hara. His eyes have the same upturned curve at the corners as mine in Audrey's self-portrait. I slammed the book shut. The sound of my heartbeat hurt my eardrums. The phone vibrated on the desktop. It was a message from Jean. I compared the blood in the iron box and found that it matched the blood on the rope that Antoine used to hang himself. Moonlight filtered in through the window, illuminating the pile of photos on the dining table. I stared at the Polaroid of Audrey's self-portrait. The corners of the person's eyes seemed to be more raised than during the day. I suddenly remembered that last Wednesday in the police archives room, Jean said he would treat me to hot chocolate from the crepe shop. Was he wearing a grey coat or a navy blue one? I can't remember. As soon as this thought came to my mind, goosebumps appeared on the back of my neck. I grabbed the Polaroid camera and took a picture under the desk lamp. There was a very shallow scratch on the back of the photo paper, and the pattern was exactly the same as the nail house marks at the murder scene. The wind came in through the window, making the photos rustle. One of them fell to the ground. It was an old work of Antoine that Pierre had dug out. The young woman in the painting raised her eyes. I stared at her pupils and suddenly realized my face is reflected there. I stared at the blood type comparison results on the phone screen, digging my nails deep into my palms. How come I suddenly can't remember the color of the jacket he was wearing when he offered me hot chocolate last Wednesday? This shouldn't be my memory. During the graduation examination at the St. Sour Police Academy, I could recount the details of every frame of the surveillance footage from 3 days ago. There were 7 Polaroid photos on the bedside table which were records of the 3 murder scenes. I grabbed the one at Mr. Gaston's, a faded oak table with coffee stains on the corners, an old portrait on the opposite wall, but I clearly remember that on the night of the incident, I squatted in front of the table and took a note. There were scratches on the edge of the crumpled paper like a knife cut, and it said, "The warehouse key is in the old place." I looked through all the photos, but there was no trace of the note. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I rushed into Hongman Lane, wrapped in a windbreaker. The moonlight cut the brick walls into pieces, and the windows of Gaston's house were dark. I fished out the spare key. People always say that I collect every spare key in the alley like a squirrel hoarding pine cones, and the moment I opened the door, the musty smell wrapped in dust rushed into my nostrils. The oak table is still in its old position. I bent over and felt the bottom of the table inch by inch, but there was no trace of glue. I opened the drawer, but there was nothing but half a box of rusty thumbtacks. "Alice?" Jean's voice came from behind. He was wearing a navy blue jacket. It turned out that he was wearing navy blue that day. I turned around suddenly, and the flashlight made him squint. In the middle of the night.
"Notes," I interrupted. "Notes from Gaston's house. I remember a scratched note saying there was a key to the warehouse."
Jean's fingers quickly flipped through the worn notebook. There is no note in the scene list. When he looked up, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes seemed to be cut by a knife. "You always say this kind of thing recently." Margaret's insulin pen, Audrey's diary. Someone tampered with my memory. I grabbed his wrist. Those paintings imitated the victim's memory, so they could tamper with mine too. Jean's palm covered me, the warmth penetrating my cold skin. "Go home first." He lowered his voice, like coaxing a frightened cat. "I'll go with you to see Lucien tomorrow." Lucien was cleaning the brass phonograph with a soft bristled brush when the doorbell of the junk shop rang at 7 in the morning. I spread out the 7 portraits on his tea-stained counter, and his beard twitched. These are not painted by the same person, but the styles are all very old. Old is just a disguise. He picked up the painting of Gaston and tapped the frame with his fingernails. The shadows in this painting are the angle of the factory warehouse in 1985. My grandfather drew a lighting map for the warehouse back then. He turned to the painting of Margaret and said, "The warm yellow in this painting is the desk lamp in the finance office. It's 30 watts, an old Philips model. My mother used it when she was an accountant in the textile factory." He suddenly paused and traced the edge of Audrey's self-portrait with his fingertips. "Some paintings," he looked up at me, with a small fire burning in his eyes, "exist to make people forget." The surveillance video from the police station's archives was retrieved at 3 p.m. Marguerite Fernandez's face flickers on and off the screen. She is Gaston's daughter, and the only person who witnessed her mother's insulin pen being swapped. In the first half, she was still crying, saying, "I saw a woman in a grey coat enter my mother's room." In the second half, she suddenly slammed the table and dug her nails into the armrests of the interrogation chair. "I didn't say that. I've never seen a grey coat before." Hallucinogens. I bit out these 3 words into the surveillance video. Jean's coffee cup made a soft sound on the table. It wasn't mentioned in the forensic report. That's an old recipe from 30 years ago. I remembered the old prescription in Audrey's diary. Antoine O'Hara's mother was a pharmacist. Her notes included the ratio of datura and belladonna. The glass in the prison visiting room was freezing cold. Margaret's prison uniform was wrinkled, and when she came closer, I could smell a faint scent of bitter almonds. "You think you are the one who sees everything?" She suddenly smiled, her mouth wide open. "But you are also part of the painting." I stood up suddenly, and the chair made a harsh sound on the ground. Her laughter followed. Audrey said that painting is not about recording the past, but about shaping the present. When I returned to the office, the setting sun was pouring onto the windowsill. I opened the black notebook that always carried with me, and on the first page was the first photo I had taken of the scene. Mr. Gaston's back lying on the carpet, with the old portrait hanging on the wall. But now that Polaroid has become another painting. The person in the painting is wearing my black windbreaker, and standing under the brick building in Hongman Lane. Her eyes were empty and the corners of her mouth were twisted, as if someone had erased all her emotions with an eraser. What gave me the chills the most was the edge of the picture frame, that extremely shallow scratch which was exactly like the nail house mark at the crime scene. The phone vibrated in my pocket. I picked up the phone and it was Gine's voice. Audrey's neighbor said that she went back to the old house in Redgate Lane tonight. I grabbed my car keys, knocking over my mug on the table as I turned. The coffee spilled onto the notebook and flowed down the portrait of me like a spreading blood stain. As my fingers rested on the doorknob, I suddenly remembered the old photo on the last page of Audrey's diary. Antoine O'Hara's eyes had the same upturned curve as mine in the painting. When I parked my car at the entrance of Hongman Alley, the street lights were lighting up one after another. The shutters of the old house were half open, and Audrey's shadow swayed behind the curtains like a dead leaf blown by the wind. The wooden door of the entrance hall was not locked. When I opened the door, she was standing in the middle of the living room, holding an unframed painting in her hand. The edge of the drawing paper was curled up, revealing another piece of paper underneath. It was Mrs. Madeleine's face before her death, her mouth half open, and her pupils dilated like a ball of black mist. You knew it. I reached for the pistol at my waist and put it down. Her fingers scratched white marks on the frame. Those portraits were not drawn by ghosts, but by living people. She looked up at me, the wrinkles at the end of her eyes soaked with water. Have you seen the basement? The stairs creaked. The musty smell in the basement made people cough. There were more than 20 paintings piled against the wall, wrapped in old newspapers. I tore off the topmost newspaper and saw the back of Mr. Gaston lying on the carpet, exactly the same as the photo I took in my Polaroid. This is my brother's last work. Audrey's voice was muffled in her throat. He said he wanted the world to remember how they looked before they died. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Jane's number popped up, and in the background was the sound of papers being shuffled in the archives. Found it. After the textile factory incident in 1993, a wandering painter appeared in Hongman Lane. Witnesses said that he always painted people by the window, muttering, "Painting can preserve the soul." The police suspected he was involved in 3 sudden deaths of elderly people, but they had no evidence. Name? I stared at Gaston's clenched right hand in the painting. What he was holding before he died was half of a demolition compensation agreement. Louis Duran. John lowered his voice. Audrey's brother. The light bulb in the basement suddenly flashed twice. Audrey flipped open another painting, revealing the face of Margaret's mother. Her hands were shaking as she injected insulin, and a woman in a grey coat stood behind her, exactly the same as Margaret had described in the surveillance video. He's crazy. Audrey dug her nails into her palms. He said those old men killed Antoine, and their deaths must be painted and remembered. But the police didn't believe him. The residents called him a lunatic, and even I thought he was talking nonsense, until last month, when he burned his last self-portrait under the bridge, saying, "It's time for a living person to take over." Goosebumps formed on the back of my neck. Antoine O'Hara, Claire's father, the apprentice who was slandered and hanged himself. The phone rang again. It was Pierre from the construction site, and his voice was breathless. "Alice, when I was demolishing a wall, I found a letter that had been stuck in the cracks between the bricks for 30 years.
When the photo of the letter was sent to me, I almost crushed my phone.
On the yellowed paper, the signature of Antoine O'Hara is like a flame. If the law cannot judge them, let the painting judge them. Louis will record the deaths. Claire will uncover the truth. Margaret's mother hides the ledger. And as for you, Alice Marlowe." I looked up suddenly. Audrey was staring at me. Her eyes overlapped with the photo of Antoine in the diary, and the upward curve at the end of her eyes was exactly the same as my own in the mirror. "Who are you?" "His illegitimate daughter," Audrey continued for me. "My mother was his childhood sweetheart. Claire and I are half-sisters." She forced a wry smile. "After Louis went crazy, I delivered paintings for him. Claire grew up and avenged him. Margaret was drugged with hallucinogens and told the truth for him. We were all pawns in the painting. I fished out my notebook. The Polaroid photo that became my portrait is still there, with the nail house mark on the edge of the frame, overlapping with the scratches at the crime scene. So this is what Margaret meant when she said you are part of the painting too. Audrey didn't answer. She pulled out a painting from the bottom floor. In the painting was a woman in a black windbreaker, standing at the bottom of the brick building in Hongmen Lane. Exactly the same outfit I was wearing when I went out this morning. Louise said you would be the final piece of the puzzle. She thrust the painting into my arms. Now the puzzle is complete. The sound of bulldozers demolishing Hongmen Lane started at 5 in the morning. I stood at the old street corner and watched the last red brick wall covered with ivy fall down. In the rubble, Mrs. Madeline's ball of wool rolled out, covered in dust. Jane came over with a report in his hand. I wrote, "There is more than one truth, as you said." The director approved it. Claire's application for sentence reduction will be considered. Audrey, he paused. She turned herself in and said that all the paintings were her brother's last wish and had nothing to do with her. I touched the painting in my arms. In the painting Audrey gave me, the woman has her back to the camera, walking towards a blurry light. "What is justice?" I whispered to the wind. Jean said nothing. He took off his police hat, revealing his white hair, amid the roar of the bulldozers. I heard my own heartbeat, overlapping with the words Antoine wrote before he hanged himself 30 years ago. Let the painting judge. As the wind blew through the ruins, the drawing paper in my arms trembled slightly. I looked down at it. The sunlight shone through the back of the paper, revealing the outline of the woman in the painting. Something seemed to be moving at the back of her head, like turning back. I stuffed the painting into my backpack and turned to walk towards the parking lot. The setting sun stretched the shadows very long, and they fell on the rubble like an unfinished portrait. I stuffed the painting into my canvas bag and turned the key 3 times in the lock. The desk lamp was turned to the brightest setting, and the drawing paper was spread out on the dining table. The creases on the back were yellowed with age. I reached out for my magnifying glass. On the edge of the canvas, a line of pencil writing was almost covered by paint. The letters E. Duran, 1985 emerged from the gap in the frame like a thin snake. The phone slammed against the keyboard. The cursor of the archive system jumped rapidly. Emile Duran, Audrey's brother, was a witness to the apprentice incident at the Montmartre textile factory in 1983. He was sent to Sainte-Anne Hospital for mental problems in 1985 and hanged himself in the storage room 3 months later. E is his initials. I stared at the back of the figure in the black windbreaker in the painting. At 5 o'clock this morning, I was wearing this windbreaker and standing in front of the ruins of Hongmen Lane. My posture was exactly the same as in the painting. How can a canvas from 30 years ago depict me 30 years later? The phone vibrates. Jean's message popped up. Isabelle said she has something to discuss in the cafe downstairs from her. Isabelle Renault, a 79-year-old retired worker, just signed the demolition agreement yesterday. When I arrived, she was picking at the rim of her coffee cup with her fingernails, her knuckles turning white. That madman. She looked up, her eyes bloodshot. Emile does more than just paint. I handed her the box of sugar cubes, but she refused to take it. In the winter of 1983, Henry, the accountant of the textile factory, fell down the stairs. 3 days before his death, Emile gave me a painting. Henry was lying on the stairs with blood all over the back of his head. Her throat tightened. Later, Henry really fell down, and his posture was exactly the same as in the painting. He killed someone? Gina. No, Isabelle shook her head. He seemed to be able to see death. On the night when the textile factory's shoddy work was exposed, the warehouse manager said he saw Emile standing outside the window with a painting in his arms. The painting showed him being engulfed in fire. Goosebumps appeared on the back of my neck. The warehouse manager's death in a fire was a cold case on last week's case file. There was a ding. Pierre's message came in. I found something at the construction site. Take a look. The metal plate felt heavy in my palm. The front is engraved with ED, and the words on the back are worn and rough, but still recognizable. Memory is the canvas, I am the pen. These paintings, are they being continued? He asked, on the phone. This morning, when I was cleaning up the broken bricks, I saw a small painting stuck in the cracks of the wall. It showed Old Song squatting on a construction site smoking, but Old Song moved to the suburbs 3 days ago. I clenched the metal plate so tightly that my nails dug into my flesh. Audrey's doorbell rang 3 times before she came to answer the door. Is there any air? I slapped the metal plate on the entrance cabinet. Her woolen hat slid down to her forehead, revealing her bluish scalp. My brother had a student at St. Anna's Hospital. She turned and rummaged through the drawer. The kid always squatted outside the window to watch him paint, saying, I want to finish what I haven't finished. The photos were spread out on the table. On the yellowed photo paper, the young man stood beside the easel, wearing a blue cloth shirt that was washed to a pale color, his eyes as bright as 2 nails. I recognized these eyes. Claire's brother. I heard my voice shaking. Lucas O'Hara. Audrey's fingers stroked the edge of the photo. When Claire came to me, she said Lucas disappeared 6 years ago. She thought he was dead. I rushed back to the apartment and spread all the files on the floor. Claire's social worker file, Audrey's hospital records, Emil's death certificate, and the paintings. The nail house mark on the back of each one, suddenly connected into a line. 30 years ago, Emil used paintings to expose the dark side. 30 years later, Claire used paintings to seek revenge. And Lucas, I took out the photo Audrey had given me. There was a line of pencil writing on the back. Old Montmartre Warehouse, District 3. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind blew in through the window, making the case files rustle. I grabbed my coat and twirled my keys around my fingers. The voice-controlled lights in the corridor lit up one by one with the footsteps, and the shadows were stretched out very long, like a portrait that was not fully dried. The address was on the back of the photo Audrey had given her, wrinkled and stained with tea. I fumbled for my car keys in the dark. As the engine noise broke through the silence of the night, I suddenly remembered what Isabel said. Emil's paintings are never the end. In the rearview mirror, the light from the apartment window gradually shrank. I stepped on the accelerator, and the tire rolled over a piece of broken leaf. The shape of the leaf was exactly the same as the background of a painting in the case file. Rain was streaming down the windshield as I parked in the old warehouse district of Montmartre. The iron door of Area 3B had rusted to a dark brown color, and the house number was mostly covered by moss. I rubbed it with my sleeve, and finally saw the faded numbers clearly. They were exactly the same as the address on the back of the photo. When the hand knocking on the door was suspended in midair, the door suddenly opened a crack. Half of a wrinkled face peeked out from the crack in the door. The old woman's white hair was wrapped in a blue cloth, and the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes looked like they were carved with a knife. Looking for Lucas, I was stunned. She held onto the door frame and moved aside. He rented this room 3 years ago, saying he was looking for old things. When he left a box of things, saying if anyone comes to ask, I'll give them to them. The cardboard box was placed in the corner, and the musty smell mixed with the turpentine smell made people's noses sore. I opened the lid of the box, and a stack of drawing paper slid out. The first was of a cast-iron street lamp in Redgate Lane. The crack on the lampshade was exactly the same as the photo I took of the scene last week. The second was the day Claire was arrested. She was pinned to the police car, and I was standing 3 steps away holding up a Polaroid camera. Even the half of the ID card sticking out of my windbreaker pocket was drawn exactly. He said he was recording the truth. The old woman suddenly spoke, her fingers like dry branches tapping the drawing paper. One night I heard some noise and leaned over the window to see him squatting on the ground drawing ants in the cracks of the wall. As he drew, he said, "I remember everything they thought they could erase." My phone vibrated in my pocket. Jean Poirot's number popped up, and in the background there was the sound of pages turning in the archives. I checked Lucas's household registration. He was registered missing 15 years ago, and the reason was written as warehouse fire. He paused. But there is no body in the file, no witnesses, and even the traces of the fire were cleaned up too cleanly. I squeezed the paper tightly. "What do you mean? Maybe he's not dead at all." His Alsatian accent suddenly became thicker. The fire scene was at the Montmartre textile factory, the same area as Emile's case. The edges of the drawing paper hurt my palms. Pierre's phone rang immediately afterwards, his breathing as heavy as a broken bellows. "Marlowe, there's something going on at the construction site. I was on night shift and saw a man rummaging through the rubble. He sneaked around to avoid surveillance and went to the old warehouse." He lowered his voice. "That face is exactly the same as the photo of Lucas you showed me." As I rushed out the door, the old woman's voice caught up with me. "There is a diary in the box." I grabbed the yellowed notebook and stuffed it into the inner pocket of my windbreaker. The sound of the tires rolling over the puddles drowned out the sound of rain. The iron door of the warehouse was ajar, and a ray of light leaked through the gap. I took out my gun and moved in along the wall. Pierre's shadow huddled in the corner, mouthing the word inside. Turning around a pile of scrap wood, I saw him. The blue shirt was washed white, and just like in the photo, he stood in front of the easel with his back to me. Hearing the footsteps, he slowly turned around, his eyes shining like two nails, exactly the same as the descriptions of all the eyewitnesses at the scene of the painting spirit seeking revenge in the case file. "You're Lucas O'Hara." I held the gun with my hand steady. "Explain." He didn't hide, but smiled. "I know what you want to ask, but I'm not the murderer. I'm just—" He tapped the new painting on the easel with his fingertips, continuing the mission of my father and uncle. In the painting, Margaret had her throat strangled by invisible hands. Her eyeballs bulged out, and black blood was flowing from the corners of her mouth. She looked completely different from the arrogant face she had when I went to the prison to interrogate her this morning. Her father Gaston was the mastermind behind the destruction of evidence back then. He said, "They thought the compensation would silence everyone, but my father's blood and Claire's 10 years of forbearance must be settled." The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was news from the forensic department. Marguerite Fernand is dead. The autopsy showed neurotoxins, which require long-term preparation. I stared at the black blood in the painting, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. This was not a coincidence at all. "You knew she would die." I took a step closer. The painting was a preview. He didn't deny it. "I will draw what they forget." He pointed to the bulge in my windbreaker. "The diary in your pocket. Turn to the first page." I took out the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was crooked, as if it was written by a teenager. They burned my father's paintings and buried my uncle's injustice. But memory is the canvas, and I am the pen. What they forget I will paint. Suddenly sirens sounded outside the warehouse. Pierre rushed in and shouted, "Backup is here." But Lucas stepped back, and when he reached the window, he suddenly turned over and jumped out. I rushed to the window and saw only a vague shadow in the rain, climbing up along the abandoned pipe and disappearing into the night in a blink of an eye. I clutched the diary tightly. There were dark spots on the cover. I couldn't tell whether it was paint or blood. Jean Poirot's voice came from the intercom. "All surveillance cameras around Hongmen Lane have been adjusted. He can't get far." I stared at Margaret's portrait on the easel and suddenly said, "Block off the area around Redgate Lane. Set up checkpoints at all exits and check every car that leaves." The rain was getting heavier and heavier, hitting the tin roof with a crackling sound. The diary was wet by the rain, and the words on the first page were blurred, like a drop of spreading blood. As I put the walkie-talkie back on my waist, Raindrops dripped down the brim of my hat onto the back of my neck. Jean Poirot's voice was still buzzing. All 6 exits of Redgate Alley are blocked, and the City Hall has just approved the citywide surveillance access authority. I wiped my face and took out the wrinkled diary from my pocket. The page where Lucas jumped out of the window and knocked. The ink soaked into dark red butterflies by the rain. Check psychiatric hospitals, art schools, and flea markets. I shouted into the intercom. All records with the initials Duran or E. My photographic memory was like a red-hot knife at this moment, and the details of the portrait of Margaret in the warehouse were seared on my retina. The pinch marks on her neck were overlapped 3 times with burnt brown, and the highlight of her eyeball was 3 millimeters to the left. Exactly the same as the posture she had when she slammed the table in the prison surveillance this morning. The screen of the technical department flashed before my eyes. I stood in the front row of the command center, my fingers quickly swiping across the touchpad, and 720 surveillance images flipped across my retina.
3:17 in the morning, side door of the Saint-Germain archives. The man in the grey jacket looked down at his watch, with a light birthmark on the back of his neck.
I slammed the table. Stop. Timestamp. May 19th, 2023. 15:07. Basement library of the École des Beaux-Arts d'Orsay. I pointed to the brown paper bag in the man's hand. He borrowed the 19th century Montmartre textile factory workers' survival archives from the Louvre's restoration room last Thursday, and bought a copy of Toxicology Atlas 1870-1910 from a used bookstore on the Seine 3 days ago. E. Duran, the technical detective, gasped. He has logged visits to 37 institutions under this pseudonym. I clenched the diary tightly, and the dark spots on the cover rubbed against my palm like a piece of burning charcoal. The intercom suddenly exploded. Poirot has found something here. Jean Poirot's voice was mixed with the coughing of dust. A manuscript was found in the attic of Audrey Duran. I heard the crisp sound of papers turning. The title is The Trial of the Painted Soul, Memory as a Murder Weapon, and the author is Emile Duran, Lucas's father. He thinks there are loopholes in the law. Audrey's voice floated from the background, as gentle as the hot cocoa handed out at a community clinic. Those who destroyed evidence wiped their hands in court and said, "I don't remember," but memories can't be burned or buried. Someone has to draw them out. I stared at E. Duran's profile on the screen, and suddenly remembered what Mrs. Madeline had said. Claire always says, some debts have to be paid for the dead. It turned out that it was not Claire who was guiding Lucas, but Lucas who was guiding Claire. When the rain stopped, Pierre called. His breathing was as heavy as a broken bellows. I was at the drainage pipe of the construction site in Area B, and saw a figure going down. He paused for 2 seconds. Blue cloth shirt with a birthmark on the back of his neck. I grabbed my coat and rushed out, my leather heels tapping the ground loudly. The lights in the command center flickered overhead, and Jean Poirot's voice followed over. Support will arrive in 5 minutes. The musty smell from the underground pipes, mixed with the smell of rust, penetrated my nose. I raised the tactical flashlight, and the beam swept across the wet brick wall, illuminating Pierre's back at the corner. He was squatting at the drain, holding half a brick in his hand, with dismantled guardrails piled at his feet. He's down there. Pierre turned around, sweat dripping from his forehead. I pretended to pick up tools and pulled the ladder away. There was a rustling sound coming from deep inside the pipe. I gestured to the support to disperse, and I slowly moved forward along the wall. The beam of light swept across a piece of blue cloth. Lucas was sitting in the water with his back to me, with a few wet paintings spread out at his feet. You can't get away. My voice hit the brick wall. You prepared Margaret's poison, and you wrote Claire's plan, right? He didn't look back. The new painting on the easel was dripping with water. It was of Jean Poirot. The old policeman was flipping through a worn notebook, his pen tip resting on the page of Montmartre Textile Factory. You think you're solving a case. His voice was like sandpaper soaked in water, But in fact you are also in the painting. The sound of support footsteps came from behind. As I rushed over, he suddenly grabbed a painting and stuffed it into his arms. As the SWAT handcuffs clicked shut, he looked up at me, his eyes bright as nails. "See you in the interrogation room, detective. You'll understand that memory is the sharpest pen." My shadow was reflected in the one-way glass of the interrogation room. I touched the Polaroid camera in my pocket. It was the first photo taken before the demolition of Hongman Lane. The red brick wall was covered with ivy, and the cast-iron street lights cast a dim shadow. Lucas sat opposite, the handcuffs on his wrists shining coldly, but he still had that smiling face. "Tell me about it." I flipped open the case file. Margaret's poison, Claire's motive, and the trial in your painting. He tilted his head and looked at me, as if he was looking at an unfinished painting. "Do you really think I'm the murderer? I'm just repainting the evil they have hidden in their memories." I squeezed the pen tightly and poked a hole in the paper with the tip. His eyes swept across the police badge on my chest, and then fell on the diary bulging in my pocket. "Do you want to hear the truth?" He licked his lips. "What you found is just the first painting." There were footsteps in the corridor. When I stood up, his voice came over to me. "In the next painting, there will be you." I pushed the door open and saw Jean Poirot leaning against the wall smoking. He put out his cigarette in the trash can and handed over a brown paper bag. Audrey gave it to me. She said it was Lucas's creative notes. A photo fell out of the paper bag. I bent over to pick it up and saw written in red on the back of the photo, "To Alice Marlowe, everything you remember is a paintbrush." The evening breeze blew in from the stairwell, making the pages of the case files rustle. I looked at the closed door of the interrogation room and suddenly remembered the portrait of Margaret in the warehouse. The black blood at the corner of her mouth and the smudged ink on the diary were exactly the same color. "Are we going to start the interrogation?" Jean Poirot patted my shoulder. I straightened my windbreaker and put the photos back into the paper bag. As the metal door closed behind him, Lucas's gaze felt like a needle piercing the back of his neck. "We can start now." I sat back in my chair and opened my notebook. His fingers tapped the tabletop, very slowly, as if he was counting the lines on a canvas. "Where should I start?" He smiled. "Let's start from the day you first walked into Hongman Lane." The lights in the interrogation room were so bright that they hurt my eyes. I held the pen and the tip of the pen spread ink dots on the document. Lucas sat opposite, his handcuffs shining coldly, a smile still on his lips, as if he was looking at an unfinished oil painting. "Were you the one who arranged Margaret's poison and Claire's stabbing?" I asked in a low voice. He tilted his head. "I just repainted the evil they hid in their memories." "You copied your father and uncle's paintings and led them to their deaths." I turned to the scene photos of Margaret's case. "Is this also a record?" "Recording requires guidance." He tapped the table with his knuckles, very slowly, as if counting the lines on a canvas. "Just like you use a Polaroid camera to freeze the scene, I use paint to freeze the truth." "Who else is involved?" I leaned forward. "Claire has been arrested." "Who is behind you?" He suddenly laughed out loud, the sound like sandpaper scraping against iron. "Some people never leave Hongman Lane." The door opened. Jean Poirot stood there, holding a cigarette case in his hand, his knuckles white. "I'm taking 3 days off," he said in a muffled voice. "My old illness has come back again." I stood up. "Need help?" "No need." He took out a metal box from his pocket and pushed it in front of me. It's an old tape found in the community archives, an interview recording from 30 years ago. It may be related to the case. There was dust on the iron box, and his hands were shaking when I took it. At the end of the interrogation, Lucas stared at the back of my neck and said, "Next, it's your turn." I took the iron box back to the office, locked the door, and put the tape into the old tape recorder. Zzz. After the sound of electricity, a hoarse male voice came out. "I am E, Duran's assistant. 30 years ago, there was an unrecorded apprentice in the textile factory. He was good at imitating the styles of all the painters, but he didn't even leave his name. I hit pause, my heart pounding against my ribs. Duran, Audrey Duran's brother, was a full-time painter in the factory mentioned by Lucy. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Pierre's message popped up, with a photo attached. A painting on the wall of the ruins, with the background being the abandoned house at the deepest part of Redgate Alley. Mr. Zhang, from the construction site, said he saw a hooded man painting there last night. He sent another message. It's the same background as the one in Lucas' warehouse. I stared at the photo. The painting on the warehouse wall does have this abandoned house in the background. It was the last one Lucas drew before he was arrested. The doorbell to Isabelle Renault's house rang 3 times before the door trembled open. The old man held onto the door frame, his eyes cloudy. Is it the policewoman? I want to ask you about the painter who worked in the textile factory back then. I showed my ID. She turned and walked towards the inner room, the wooden chair making a harsh sound on the floor. The drawer opened and closed, and she came back, clutching a yellowed piece of paper. I've remembered it my whole life. The words on the note were blurry, but I could clearly see Antoine, Emile, Audrey, and finally little Elle. That child always hides in the corner to draw. She stroked little Elle with her fingertips. We all pretended he didn't exist, but he drew everything. Who is Xiaolo? I asked. She suddenly coughed violently, and the note fell to the ground. I bent over to pick it up and saw something written in pencil on the back. His eyes like a wolf. The ruins of Hongmen Lane look like a ghost town late at night. I shone the flashlight on the wooden door of the abandoned house. The door hinge creaked, and a musty smell came out. There is a new picture hanging on the wall. The woman turns her back to the camera and walks towards a white light. I touched the back of the canvas, and my fingertips touched the convex and concave words. Goodbye. The flashlight swept across the edge of the frame, and there was a line of words so small that you had to stick them on it to read them clearly. Do they remember you? The wind blew in through the broken window, making the drawing paper rustle. I took off my gloves and gently stroked the small words. The sound of sirens came from the distance, getting closer and closer. I rolled up the painting carefully and tucked it in the crook of my arm. When I left, the wooden door slammed shut behind me, and the echo hit the broken wall, like someone saying, "It's your turn." When I rushed into the police station with my windbreaker wrapped tightly around me, the back of my neck was still stained with moldy ash from the ruins. The scroll was pressed under my arm, and the corners were hurting. The painting that I found in the abandoned house was now swaying gently with my footsteps. The old computer in the technology department hummed as I stuffed the Polaroid photos into the scanner. The moment the screen lit up, I moved closer. The brushstroke comparison results popped up in a red box, indicating that the similarity with the portraits of the previous 7 murder scenes was only imitation. I muttered to the air. When you scroll the mouse wheel downward, the system analysis marks the deliberate copying features. The pause when the brush tip is tightened, the arc of the shadow blending. While the artist in the previous painting seemed to be declaring his presence, this one seems to be hiding something. The phone vibrated 3 times. Pierre's message popped up. Come to the site office, I found something. The smell of coffee wafted from the prefabricated house on the construction site, and he pulled out a hardcover notebook from the rubble bag. On the faded blue paint on the cover, the words Elf's album were worn white. Old Jean dug it out when he was clearing the foundation. It was stuck in the cracks between the broken bricks. He rubbed his hands. Take a look. I opened the first page. The pencil sketch was a distorted representation of the cast iron lamp in Redgate Lane, an exact replica of the one in Lady Madeline's window. The second page showed an old lady in an apron adding wood to the coal stove. I recognized her as Mrs. Gaston, who had passed away last week. Turning to the middle, a line of pencil words pierced my eyes. I will draw what they dare not see. Can you give it to me? I held the notebook tightly. It was originally given to you. He scratched the back of his head. By the way, Lao Zhang said that the location where this book was buried seemed to be hidden on purpose. Isabel's house was heated too high, and when I took off my gloves, my knuckles were still caked with construction dust. She stared at my open diary and suddenly grabbed my wrist with her skinny hand. It's him. It's him. Her nails dug into my skin. Little L, the little L, who always squatted in the corner of the textile factory warehouse. Who did he learn painting from? I asked softly. Antoine O'Hara and Emile Duran. Her voice suddenly trembled. Then one day, his easel disappeared. Some people said he was crazy and ran in the rain with his canvas. Some people said the foreman drove him out of Paris. No one dared to ask. I pulled my hand back and saw purple bruises on her cuffs, the same shape as the marks left on the arms of the previous victims. Lucien's thrift store smells of turpentine. He was wiping the copper candlesticks with a soft cloth when I pushed the diary in front of him. This is not written by a child. His magnifying glass stopped at the line. I want to draw what they dare not look at. The pen pressure is even as if it was carved. It's a trick that adults use to imitate children's handwriting. He turned around and opened the bottom drawer of the counter. The iron box made a dull sound as it hit the wood. I have kept these letters for 30 years. He opened the box, revealing a few stamps from the yellowed letter paper. From 1985 to 2018, there was one letter every Christmas, and each one said, "To those who remember the truth." I pulled out the top one. The handwriting was exactly the same as in the diary. They burned my paintings, but they couldn't burn away what was in my eyes. At 11 o'clock in the evening, I stood at the door of the abandoned house. The wind rushed in through the broken window, making the back of my neck feel cold. The door hinges didn't make any noise this time. Someone had oiled them beforehand. The wall is empty. I turned on the flashlight and swept the beam across the ground. The chalk writing was crooked, like a child's. You are not the last one to remember them. The wind suddenly grew stronger, making the scraps of paper in the corner rustle. I bent down to pick up a piece. It was half a photo. A man in work clothes was holding a little girl wrapped in a red scarf, with the chimney of a textile factory in the background. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from the technical department. We have found a new clue. All the paintings marked with the nail house mark, except for the seventh one, were created by the same person. I stared at the blank wall. I finally understood what Mrs. Madeline meant when she said, "The person in the painting will take your life on the night of demolition." It is never the ghost of just one person. The sound of sirens came from the distance, getting closer and closer. I reached for the pistol at my waist, and my fingertips touched that half photo. There is a line of small words on the back of the photo, blurred by time. "Dad, I will paint all the truth for you." The wind blew scraps of paper into my face. I turned toward the sound of the sirens and heard a sigh coming from deep within the ruins, very much like the sob that rolled in Isabel's throat when she mentioned Little L. In the glass isolation booth of the courtroom the next day, Lucas hung his head. When the bailiff pushed him, he suddenly looked up at me, his eyes as bright as a wolf. The marble floor of the courtroom shone with a cold light. I squeezed Lucas's elbow and the handcuffs made a soft sound against the metal bars. He was like a crumpled piece of newspaper. He didn't say a word from the interrogation room to the dock, until the bailiff opened the side door of the courtroom. "Let's go see that exhibition." He suddenly turned his head and rubbed his chin against the back of my hand, causing his stubble to prick my face painfully. I paused. There was a buzz of chatter in the gallery, and the bailiff tapped the ground with his baton. "What exhibition?" I lowered my voice. "The old gallery downtown." He stared at his frayed cuffs. "Ghost portrait. It's almost closed." The day the verdict came down, Jean Pourre's plaster had just been removed. He stood at the door of the bureau leaning on a bamboo cane, with a leather notebook bulging in the pocket of his windbreaker. That notebook had been with him for 30 years, recording every wedding and funeral in Hongman Lane. To the gallery, I repeated Lucas's words to him. He didn't respond, just slapped the notebook on my palm. I opened it and saw an old photo on the last page. A dozen young people in work clothes were huddled together in front of the Montmartre textile factory. The apprentice at the edge had his shoulders hunched and had a dark red birthmark on his Adam's apple. The gallery is on the back street of the Opera House, with a faded sign bearing a banner that reads 3 days left until closing. When I opened the door, the bell rang shrilly, and a musty smell mixed with turpentine came out. There's a sign in the center of the exhibition hall. The works in this exhibition are all from the scene of the Hongman Lane serial murders. My stomach suddenly tightened. Hanging on the walls were portraits we found at Gaston's, Emile's, and Audrey's homes. The people in the paintings are all the same young man. His eyebrows and eyes are like charcoal pencils soaked in water, blurry but dazzling. Jean tapped the tip of his cane on the floor. That apprentice in the textile factory, Leon Noir, I said. When I was flipping through the files the night before, this name flashed across the old court records. The defendant in a cloth theft case hanged himself on a beam in a warehouse. There is a new painting at the end of the exhibition hall. The picture frame is made of old pine wood, with white stubble on the edges. When I got closer, I let his breath brush across the back of my neck. This is... The woman in the windbreaker stood in front of the ruins of Hongman Lane, with broken bricks piled at her feet and a worn notebook in her hand. That's my windbreaker, my notebook, to the last guardian of memory. I read the words on the back of the canvas, and the ink spread like tears that had not been wiped away. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Pierre Rossu's number popped up. He was the foreman of the Redgate Lane demolition team. He had just found Audrey's passbook buried in cement at the construction site the day before yesterday. Alice? His voice trembled. Someone called and said I was an important witness and asked me to go to the gallery at 10 o'clock tonight for a private viewing. Don't go, I blurted out. But he said, he sniffed, that Leon Noir's album was waiting for me. I held the phone tightly. Leon Noir, the little L mentioned by Lucas, and the name Claire wrote repeatedly in the diary hidden in the attic. I'm in the cafe across from the gallery. I pressed the record button. Once you go in, keep the call going every step of the way. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the lights in the gallery came on time. Pierre's breathing escaped from the phone, carrying an echo. The door is not locked. Is the painting moving? No, it's the arrangement that has changed. How did it change? I held Rang's wrist. His pulse was beating very fast. The first one is Gaston's. The second one is Emile's. Now they are connected in a line, like an arrow. Follow the arrows, Jean suddenly said. In the old houses in Hongman Lane, the positions of the paintings all point to the emergency exits. The sound of footsteps coming from the phone became increasingly muffled. We've reached the stairs. The basement door is open. Pierre's voice dropped. There's a wall, covered with photos. As Jean and I rushed across the street, the lock on the gallery's back door was picked. The musty smell in the basement was even stronger, and the light bulb above was shaking, casting distorted shadows on the objects on the wall. Pierre stood in front of the wall, his cell phone shining on the photos covered with yellow tape. Antoine's funeral, Emile's back as he counted his bank books, Audrey's hands as she tore up a letter. In the middle was an old photo of a young man in work clothes, looking up and smiling. The red birthmark on his Adam's apple, looking like a drop of solidified blood. Leon Noir. This is... Pierre pointed to the newspaper clipping below the photo. From the 1985 edition of Paris Workers. A textile factory cut corners, causing the fabric to catch fire. The apprentice took the blame and died unjustly. The display case is in the corner and the glass is covered with dust. I wiped it clean with my sleeve. Inside was a hardcover diary with a shiny cover. The words on the title page made my fingertips tremble. If the truth cannot be expressed in words, let it be painted. Leon Loire, Winter. Jean's cane knocked over the easel next to the display case. I looked up and found that the portrait of me had been moved to the opposite side at some point. The me in the painting is standing in front of the ruins, with dark brown eyes, exactly the same as what I see in the mirror. The wind suddenly blew in. The basement window was not closed tightly, and the wind blew the canvas rustling. I stared into the eyes of the woman in the painting, and for a moment her eyelashes seemed to tremble, like a living person blinking. The lock of the diary gleamed in the display case. I took out the thin wire I had obtained from the bureau and was about to poke it into the keyhole, when someone suddenly held my hand. His fingers were cold as he pointed at the curled corner of the last page of the diary. "Look at the back." I held my breath and gently opened it. I turned over a corner of the page. The ink seeped into the yellowed back of the paper. It was Leon's handwriting, even more sloppy than before. "My name is Leon Lara, but Lara is not my last name." The light bulb in the basement flickered, and the light swept across the writing. "In the spring of 1983, I found a document in my father's office. He is the owner of a textile factory in Montmartre, and I am his illegitimate child with his secretary. There was a fire accident report in the file. The fire was caused by cutting corners on the fabric. He bribed Antoine to give false testimony and put the blame on the apprentice." My throat tightened. The slandered apprentice in Claire's diary was not Leon at all. I tore up the report, but I couldn't tear up their lies. From that day on, I became little Leon. I wore work clothes, lived in a loft, and painted portraits of workers in the workshop. They said I was an enthusiastic apprentice, but I was the only one who knew that I was recording for people who were truly wronged. With a loud clang, Pierre's cell phone hit the display case. He held up a sketch, his fingertips turning white. This is a picture of me this morning." The edges of the sketch were curled and rough. In the painting, he was standing in front of the ruins, holding a piece of letter paper in his hand. It was the demolition compensation agreement torn in two that he found in Emile's house yesterday. "When was this painted?" he said, his voice trembling. "I haven't even been to a gallery today." I stared at the L mark in the lower right corner of the painting, and a chill ran down the back of my neck. Leon Noir, the man who declared that the truth must be painted, is hiding in a corner at this moment, watching our every move. "Let your phone vibrate in your pocket." He picked up the phone, hummed twice, and suddenly straightened up. "Are you sure it's an abandoned church?" After hanging up, he handed me the phone. The screen lit up with an unread draft message. "If he is the last executor of the painting spirit trial, we must stop him before he completes his last painting." The anonymous caller said that someone saw a hooded man running towards an abandoned church near the old site of Redgate Lane. He took out the worn notebook and said, "I'll go take a look. You and I take Pierre to find Isabelle." He interrupted me. She was the only worker at the fire scene who didn't sign. The lamp in Isabelle's house was covered with lace, and the light made the wrinkles on her face look like cracks. She stared at the sketch in my hand and suddenly grabbed my wrist. "That kid always said people forget, but paintings never do." She pulled a scrapbook from under the mattress, its pages so brittle that they crumbled when she squeezed them. The top clipping headline hurt my eyes. "Fire in textile factory, 3 workers missing." The photo shows the backs of 3 people in work clothes. The man on the far right has a red birthmark on the back of his neck, exactly the same as the old photo of Leon on the wall of the basement. He said he was waiting for the last painting. Isabelle dug her nails into the back of my hand. "When the painting is finished, all the lies will be burned away." A dull sound came from the direction of the abandoned church. I clutched the scrapbook tightly. Pierre's hands were shaking. "Is that the sound of a wall demolition machine?" At 2 o'clock in the morning, the door of the gallery was ajar. I walked in the dark, and my feet touched the canvas. There is a new painting in front of the display case. A woman with her back to the camera, her long hair blown by the wind, and in front of her is a dazzling white light, like the spotlight of a demolition team. Written in charcoal on the back of the canvas, "You saw me, but I'm gone." I turned around. Empty. Only the wind came in through the rear window, causing the picture frame to sway slightly. I reached out to help, and my fingertips brushed the edge of the frame. There was a line of tiny words, lightly carved with a carving knife. "Do they still remember you?" The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Jean. "There is an unfinished painting in the church crypt. There's someone missing in the painting." I stared at the figure in the painting with his back to the light, and suddenly understood what Leon meant by the last painting. The abandoned church at the end of Hongman Lane now had a huge black mouth. When I rushed into Hongman Lane holding my phone, the roar of the wall-demolishing machine was still floating in the wind. The spire of the abandoned church stood out like a rusty knife in the night, leaving the message still lit up on the screen. "Church cellar, come quickly." The wooden door of the church was hung with half a copper lock, which creaked when pushed lightly. The smell of mold and damp earth hit me in the face. I took out my flashlight and swept the beam across the mottled icon. The Virgin Mary's eyes were painted blood red. "Let," I shouted, and the echo hit the dome and fell down. There was a piece of red cloth stuck in the gap between the bricks behind the altar. I squatted down, and just as my fingertips touched it, the whole stone wall slid to the side. The musty smell in the secret room became stronger. Canvases were nailed densely on the walls. Each frame was covered with dust, but the frames were polished to a shine. The first painting took my breath away. The painting shows a woman in a silk nightgown, holding an empty medicine bottle in her right hand, and there is a knife wound on her left wrist, which is neither deep nor shallow. It is exactly the same as the scene of Marguerite Fernand's death. In the second painting, the old man is slumped in a recliner, with an unfinished cigarette in his right hand. The label on the overturned whiskey bottle at his feet is exactly the same as the one in Gaston's wine cabinet. I took 2 steps back and shone the flashlight over the bronze plaques under all the picture frames. Financial director of the textile factory in 1992, workshop director in 1993, legal advisor in 2001. The last bronze plaque was engraved with "Son of Gaston Fernando." The phone vibrated. Jean sent the location. "I'm in the bell tower. He's here." As I rushed out of the chamber, the moonlight was filtering through the stained glass windows, casting spots of light on the nave floor that looked like broken glass. I heard footsteps on the stairs of the bell tower. I moved up the wall and saw Jean's shadow around the corner. He was holding a baton, and a hooded man was standing opposite him. "Leon?" Jean's voice was as low as stone. The hood slipped off, revealing a pale face. He smiled at Jean and said, "Mr. Poirot, you once bought me a hot croissant." Jean's baton trembled. "You shouldn't use this method. They look in the mirror every day, but they can't see the blood on their faces." Leon's voice was very soft. I just handed the mirror to them. He pointed behind me. Before Margaret took the medicine, she found a photo of her father destroying evidence on the bedside table when Gaston was drinking. The bottom of the wine bottle was stuck with a forged death certificate signed by his grandfather. "Do you think this is murder?" Jean said nothing. Leon pulled a map from his pocket and placed it on the steps. "City Archives, Section B, Cabinet 1. The rest, give it to someone who can understand the drawings." He turned and walked towards the top of the bell tower. I wanted to chase him, but he held my arm and said, "He doesn't want to escape." The red circle on the map marks the archive's underground storage room. When I called Audrey, she was mixing cobalt blue paint in her studio. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The old elevator in the archives makes you dizzy." Audrey held up a magnifying glass and rummaged through the yellowed craft paper. Suddenly she took a breath and said, "Look at this." The document was titled "Internal Investigation Report on the Montmartre Textile Factory Fire Accident On the signature page at the end, the words Gaston Fernand were circled repeatedly in red pen, with a note next to it. It is recommended to destroy the workers' testimonies to avoid compensation disputes. His father was the legal advisor back then. Audrey's fingertips were trembling. So what Leon is looking for is... It's a chain of evidence, I interrupted her. He has been collecting it for 30 years. At the deepest part of the underground warehouse there is a locked iron box with a key in the keyhole. When I opened it, rust fell on the back of my hand. Inside was full of yellowed photos, documents with official seals, and a stack of unframed sketches. At the bottom was a letter. The words looked like they were carved with a knife tip. I am not an avenger. I am a witness. Paintings can remember what people don't want to remember, and they can speak for what cannot be said. If you wish, let these paintings turn from ghosts into witnesses. It was almost dawn when I rushed to the church carrying the iron box. In the morning mist, the church spire looks like an isolated island. I pushed open the door and found that the light in the secret room was still on. There was an unfinished painting propped up in the corner. A woman in blue work clothes stood in the light, with the outlines of tall buildings behind her. Her eyes were half closed, as if she was waiting for someone to add the finishing touches. Remember them. I turned my head sharply, and the only sound was the wind blowing through the stained glass windows. There was a half-dried flake of paint on the edge of the frame. It was cobalt blue, the same shade as the newly opened tube of paint in Audrey's studio. The iron box felt hot in my arms. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jean's number. I need you to contact the technical section of the Serious Crime Unit. Evidence, he asked. Something more important than evidence. I stared at the unfinished painting, the shadow of the truth. As I closed the tin, I heard my own heartbeat, like an old drum being struck. Leon said it was testimony, but I knew when these paintings were laid out in court, more people would hold up mirrors. And what's hidden in the mirror isn't just the ghosts of the past. When I carried the iron box into the archives room of the Serious Crime Squad, the fingerprint identification report had just come out. There is no biometric information of Leon. The colleague from the technical department pushed up his glasses. The fingerprints on the drawing paper and documents belong to old people from 30 years ago. Gaston, Isabel, and several deceased textile factory managers. I pinched the edge of the iron box. That letter, the pen tip handwriting, was compared to Leon's signature when he registered in the community. It is indeed his. The colleague turned to the last page of the report, but the letter does not mention any specific criminal behavior. Legally, it can only be regarded as a personal statement. Jean stood at the door and knocked on the door frame. The prosecutor said that unless it can be proved that Leon was directly involved in the robbery and murder, otherwise he can only be considered a witness. I finished for him, digging my nails into my palms. After the day Leon disappeared in the clock tower, the city's surveillance cameras never captured him again. He had wiped himself clean from the system long ago. In the evening, I walked into the Blue Gate art space, carrying half a box of paintings. The boss was Audrey's friend. When he heard that there was going to be an exhibition of the past of Hongman Lane, he immediately cleared out the white walls in the innermost room. I put a note next to each painting, and the last one read, "This is not a curse, it is a testimony." On the opening day of the exhibition, the elderly people in Hongman Lane arrived earlier than me. Mrs. Madeline squeezed to the front with a cane, her reading glasses sliding to the tip of her nose. Is this the boiler room of the textile factory back then? I brought hot soup to the workers. Isabel stood in front of a family portrait, her fingers gently stroking the young man in blue work clothes in the painting. He always said he wanted to paint everyone's face. It turns out he really did. The crowd suddenly became quiet. I looked up and saw Pierre Rossi squeeze in, his overalls stained with cement dust, his cell phone held to his chest with the screen lit. Alice. He handed me his phone. The photo showed a mottled construction site wall with a sketch pinned to it. It was the letter I had seen in Leon's secret room, carved with a knife tip. Paintings can remember what people don't want to remember, and they can also speak for what they cannot say. I was clearing waste today and passed by the newly demolished Building 3. His Adam's apple moved. This painting was hung on a broken wall and swayed in the wind. Like someone left it there for me to see. The phone vibrated, and his message popped up. Maybe there are still people continuing. I clutched my phone tightly and looked up to see Audrey. She stood in front of an unframed sketch. Her eyes read,
"This is Emil's writing." Her voice trembled. On the day he disappeared 30 years ago, he said he was going to paint one last important painting.
It turns out, he drew me. The girl in the painting has a ponytail and is standing at the entrance of the alley, holding a stack of canvases. The background is a red brick wall, covered with ivy, almost overlapping the ruins of Hongman Alley today. He always said that I should inherit his paintbrush. Audrey took out the palette from her bag, and the cobalt blue paint glowed in the sun. I used to think that painting couldn't save people. Now I understand. Remembering is saving. She pulled out a pen and signed the exhibition register. Audrey Duran, Redgate Lane Recorder. As the crowd dispersed, I squatted in front of the painting of the woman in blue work clothes. There was a piece of dried paint stuck to the edge of the frame, which was exactly the same as the cobalt blue in Audrey's studio. Leon's last color mixing was probably for this painting. Suddenly there was a card next to the painting. On the light yellow letter paper, the crooked pen words read, "I remember them." The signature was Isabelle Renault. I put the card on the lower right corner of the frame and felt the warmth of the paper with my fingertips. Some memories are never crushed by a bulldozer. The ruins of Hongman Lane look like a black ocean late at night. I walked towards the bell tower with a flashlight, and the rustling sound of flipping papers came in the wind. As he bent over to pick it up, the flashlight swept across the paper. It was Leon's last work. The woman in the painting stands at the intersection of light and shadow, with half of her face hidden in the shadow. Behind her is the line drawing of a high-rise building, like a growing flame. Her eyes were half closed, and her eyelashes cast a thin shadow on the paper. Remember them. The wind blew broken bricks past my ears, and I carefully stuffed the painting into my backpack. When I turned around, I suddenly felt a slight vibration in my backpack. It was the drawing paper moving. I stood still, and the moonlight leaked through the gap in the broken wall and shone on the backpack. The outline of the woman in the painting sways gently on the paper, as if she will slowly turn back in the next second. The wind swept through the ruins, raising a cloud of dust. The drawing paper in the backpack was still shaking slightly. That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.